We have been making just outrageous progress on my latest mental scenery project. Edoras has been coming along really nicely and just sort of monopolizing all my time since early December. But today, we are finally returning to Helms Deep.
So it begins.
This board is already looking incredible, but today it is going to triple in size. We'll finally be finishing the deeping wall and all of the lower valley, completing this monster cliff face and the causeway, sloping down this massive mountainside to the cave entrance, and finally finishing the interior of the castle, including a massive playable stable for a Rohan cavalry horde. This is going to be the biggest video in the entire War of the Rohirrim content arc, and what better way to kick off 2025 than with a massive scenery project. But before we can get crafting, let's assess where the build is so far, and that means it's time to get Edoras out of the way. Luckily, I built this beast of a board in 2 halves, and this is only the first third of Edoras, but more on him next month. For now, he is banished to the Patreon shelves, and now we've got some room to set up all of Helm's Deep so far, including the deeping wall, the eastern cliff, and the causeway, and he is already looking mighty, but there is some work to be done. So I totally forgot just how damn big this thing is. We need to add all those extra features, cliffs in here and kind of cliffs in the causeway. But before we can do any of that, we need to work on these new areas of foundations and baseboards to support some massive Helm's Deep structures. It's timber time. I grabbed some pine and made a rough plan, and I've decided to just fully abandon the classic wargaming rectangles just like I did for Edoras in the last video, and began knocking up the perfect bespoke timber frame for our next board sections. First, a small frame for our causeway. There are some huge cliffs here, so having this in its own piece is vital. Then we need a much bigger frame for everything that's left. 25 square feet of deeping wall, cliffs, and space for the besieging army. Then some masonite hardboard sheeting to reinforce the main frame under the deeping wall, cut down to size with my multi-tool, and then a whole heap of liquid nails and screws to mount those boards in place. And then I started laying out the walls, and something seemed very off about the amount of space in front and behind the walls, and I realized I've built this frame upside down and in the wrong orientation. I am an idiot. With the correct frame position, I re-screwed it together and repaneled the frame, this time just opting to masonite the entire frame, as the slope of our valley floor is probably going to come right down to this timber level anyway, and then I built up the foam foundation under our deeping wall to get it to the right height to keep it aligned with our main board, and then glued down all the deeping wall except our destructible culvert, and then finished off our causeway with a sheet of foam and some structural supports to get the causeway sitting nicely against the front of the Hornburg Keep. All we've done is put down timber and a bit of foam, and you will not believe how long that just took. But we finally have our full board foundation. Now it's really obvious just how much work there is still to do. So, we've got a big choice here. We're kind of at a crossroads. Do I work this way around the deeping wall, or that way down the other side of the keep? Where to begin? Keep, I think. First task is to start landforming around the base of the keep. We've got some really clear reference from the Wētā Workshop collectible here, so it's simply a matter of building up the slope first with chamfered blocks of foam, and then combining some plaster rock molds to try and capture the feel of the rock formation around the base of the stonework. Happy with the layout, it is modeling compound time to blend all of our rock casts into a single cohesive rock face. My goodness, I've been doing so much rock work lately, and I am just loving it. With the board ripped back apart so I can actually set the camera up somewhere that you guys can see, I repeated the process building the landform and rocky outcrops right up into the eastern side of our causeway. A lot of this area isn't actually rock molds but loose gravel, so the casts here are only used as a feature element hinting at the massive outcrop this causeway is built into, and most of the landforming is just carved foam, which I will layer scenics onto later, including the beginnings of a riverbed which flows beneath the causeway.
The other side of the causeway, however, is not going to be light on plaster casts. It is time to build an absolutely monster cliff, the biggest I've ever made, even bigger than the monster cliff on the other side of the fortress. This causeway is actually built into a spire of rock that juts out from the valley wall, and after mocking up a heavily fortified foam skeleton, it was time to start slapping down our plaster casts to try and capture this rock formation in a way that will also read nicely for our diorama. The trick is to layer the casts in a manner that looks realistic and also kind of hides the flat terraced nature of the foam skeleton by varying the cast combinations. The key to realism is of course variety, or natural variation, to borrow a phrase from the late great S.K. Warne. There are three secrets to natural variation: having a lot of molds, changing the orientation of casts on the board, after all an upside down cast looks completely different, and only using part of a mold by either creating partial casts only filling part of the rubber, or actually cutting up larger casts with a saw and then blending them into the hill in new ways with modeling compound. It's also great fun being able to work right up to an existing structure like the causeway here, because it gives me creative cues for interesting ways to blend the rocks together. We want this outcrop to look like before the Númenórean stonemasons went to town, it would actually continue out the other side and down the slope.
I am so happy with how good this looks. The next stage is to continue this down through the riverbed and cliff up the side of the tower and into the rest of the keep. But before I can do this cliff, we need to finish the castle and we need to hop inside.
There is one very important area left on this castle that needs some attention, and it's kind of a bit of a secret. In behind the main keep, below the upper hall, in amongst all this negative space, sits the Helms Deep stables. These were designed by Alan Lee during pre-production on Lord of the Rings, but they never ended up getting built either as a bigature or as a set, as nothing was scripted to happen there. But when the Wētā Workshop collectibles team made their Helms Deep, Leonard couldn't resist bringing the stables to life, following Alan's original designs, and just like the rest of the fortress, we prepared a whole heap of digital files that were made by Wētā Workshop using the original film bigature for reference for when they made their own Helms Deep collectible to bring our stable to the tabletop. I upscaled the stables and decided this time to try something different. These files are essentially the first step of a long texturing process that ends up with a lot of physical detailing by hand by Leonard to create the stunning collectible. The files are essentially the skeleton of the stable, and I'm going to need to do the same, layering in foam and rock molds to bring my stables to life. But to try and save some time, I wanted to apply a noise filter to break up the smooth surface of the files, which is incredibly exaggerated now that I've upscaled them 5.7 times larger. I just want to emphasize these specific files aren't what actually gets used in the Wētā Workshop collectible. They haven't gone through any of the texturing process. So after a quick tutorial from my Blender guru, Jacob from Conquest Creations, I jumped back into Blender and started experimenting with different levels and styles of noise generation to get something that effectively models random looking aged stone. And I'm loving how much detail that I'm able to pack into these upscaled prints. But to truly test how they're working, we need to print off some prototypes and see them with our eyes. And with such a stunning detail, we need the ultimate FDM printer. This is the Bamboo Lab P1S. And look, I've been working with 3D printers since my early engineering days well over a decade ago, and the technology has come insanely far, but no machine has blown me away like this printer. It is hands down the most user-friendly, quirk-free, well-behaved printer I have ever had.
It is lightning fast with a top speed of 500 millimeters per second and really good acceleration, and it's just so reliable. And up here in the AMS, you can load 4 spools of filament, so you can print forever and even do multicolor options.
Before we test out our stonework, I wanted to see how fine I can get the detail on something more conventional, so I trimmed down the gate from the keep, splitting it into 2 halves and modeling some recesses so I can mount magnets later on, slapped it into Bamboo Studio, easily the greatest slicer that I've ever used, and fired it straight over to the P1S.
The detail in the prints is just insane. This guy is going to do some serious work for us, although I don't normally print in green.
Armed with enough filament to finish Helms Deep, I jumped back into Blender and modeled up 4 little test pillars with different levels of noise generation and slapped them on over to the printer, and an hour later, I've got 4 pieces to choose from, and it's amazing how helpful it is to see these textures on a real physical prototype. With my choice made, I then started to apply those noise settings to various other parts of the build, and decided to print something much bigger to see how the texture worked on a large stone structure, and this mega arched walkway split across 2 pieces is the perfect guinea pig. The prints came out absolutely gorgeously. The texture looks incredible, just a bit of cleanup to remove the supports, and then I glued our 2 halves together and blended the join with some filler and then primed it in automotive filler primer for a strong bond to the plastic for our future layers of paint.
This stone texture and the P1S are absolutely killing it. So let's throw a bunch more prints through this beast and then we can get back down to the studio.
I decided to print as much as I could of Leonard's beautiful stable files, slamming them out through the P1S, and then could not resist having a play with the super cool multicolor capabilities, loading up some very pretty filaments and printing off some goodies for my girls. In Bamboo Studio, you can assign what parts of the file you'd like to be what color, and then without me having to do anything, in the middle of the print, the P1S auto reloads the right color filament from the AMS and just keeps on printing. I mean, this is literally mind-bending stuff.
So here we have all of our glorious 3D prints, some of which I've already sub-assembled and blended with filler just to make it easier to put down the automotive primer. And now it's time to assemble this big 3D printed jigsaw puzzle into our stables.
I grabbed a sheet of foam to give me a nice flat surface to build on and began to assemble the remaining unassembled components into the full stable structure using rapid bond liquid nails. And then to lock the main walkway structures together, down goes the first of our roof arches. Next, I textured a foam sheet cut to size now that I know the footprint of the stable, and glued our structures down with foam-safe liquid nails. And then our final pillars and the second archway subassembly. Wow, this is bigger than I realized. Some polyfill now to blend all of the remaining gaps in our new sub-assemblies and to begin to blend our printed structures down into the foam environment, and then it was time for our foam detailing pass. Now, if we have a look at this video of the Helms Deep collectible, we can see that the walkway of the stable actually has flagstones, not chiseled or mined stone. So I grabbed some thin sheets of foam and slowly assembled a big flagstone pass up the ramp, around the curve, and then all the way up over the arched bridge into the upper level of the fortress. All of these were carved with a knife and then widened with a pencil and textured with foily. Then a few extra foam details went around the structure to accent our prints and tie all the foam together, and kaboom, the main stable structure is done, except for one key piece, the massive stone wall. This begins life as a huge sheet of 20mm unskinned XPS hit with a simple brickwork pattern. With the bricks carved, it gets hit with foily and bricky to build up that aged castle wall aesthetic, and then I glued down our 3D printed archway details. Before gluing these sections together, I primed all of the foam by hand with dark grey primer, much easier to reach everything before that wall is glued into place. And then outside, I reprimed the prints with a dark grey Rust-Oleum to cover any of the white polyfiller, and then accent highlighted the entire piece of stonework with light grey in a zenithal spritz. Then I glued our big wall in place, and there we have our stables, ready for the full paint job and final detailing. But now we need to mesh this very cool structure into our castle. The first job is finding a massive box.
Would you like me to find you a box?
Ah, there's one. Perfect. Thanks, Lockie lass. And then with the structure at the right height, we need to connect our doorways, starting with the top of the ramp. Some stairwells and some stone platforms created an upper stairwell, which I built onto the back of our stable wall. This access ramp goes up to the inner hall, and it's going to be amazing for gameplay. It's so useful to have lots of different ways to move through such a complex structure like this fortress. This got a coat of primer as well, and once assembled in place, we can see just how much fun that's going to be to play on.
So we've come to that part of the video that seems to happen every single episode on this project, where I realize I'm potentially about to screw up the whole board. I haven't glued in the stable. I wanted to, and I wanted to build it all in with cliffs and weight and so much more weight. This board is really heavy, and I'm worried that if I glue this in, but the frame at some point is probably going to shear, right? So this is something I could potentially keep removable, whereas the cliffs that are here at the front really have to be mounted onto the keep. But it's just going to make it so hard to build this cliff infrastructure. Is it modular, or I don't know. I don't know what to do.
So I ripped off the causeway and had a think and decided to tackle this problem with a classic Aussie/Kiwi approach. She'll be right. So once the stable module was glued onto the plinth, I started mocking up the slope of the cliff, blocking in some foam support panels, and then grabbed myself a gorgeous little archway from Microforge Mini slice and slot system and built a beautiful little gatehouse, which will eventually have its own door to make the stable entrance much more defendable. And then with that glued in place, I could return to my cliff, building the foam panels all the way up from the base to the top of the keep. Then it was time to grab a bucket load more rock molds and start laying them onto our foam skeleton, pinning them in place with skewers while the liquid nails bonds. I got it mostly planned out and then just dived into the modeling compound. Often, as I'm blending the compound into the molds, I'll see more possibilities with the casts that aren't apparent until the cliff face is coming to life. The big focus on the lower level is of course to have a little rocky outcrop for some dwarf tossing and then wrapping down to our riverbed. Then, as we move up the wall, we've got a very tricky section of almost sheer rock wall that also needs to finish nicely on an unnatural edge, which is essentially slicing into a much larger mountain. I ended up doing a lot of work on this and got a look that I was really happy with, capturing the shape of the cliff without being too massive, just big enough to hide the stable behind and have a really nice contour. Our final bit of rock work is the interior of the stable, which just needed a few molds to kind of hint at the cave-like finish of that inner stable access. I didn't build this up too high, I don't want the cliff to collapse under its own weight, but I'm really stoked with it, well worth doing.
While Helms Deep's been chugging along, I also did some work on the Patreon honor wall. So a huge shout out on the next lot of super duper Zorptrons: Daniel, Lucas, Nicholas, Layrod, Vincent, Yelma, Ghoul, Joe, Scott, and Andrew. You guys are absolute legends. Thank you so much for the support and scoring yourself a little plaque up on the honor wall. And I've also done 2 of the new Mega Zorptron statues. A huge shout out to Nick Connerwall, who scored himself Gimli in a weathered stone finish, and the Sergeant's Table with a gorgeous weathered bronze Citadel guard here on the Middle Earth section of the honor wall. You Patreons are just everything to this channel. A massive thank you. If you would like to get your name up here, a statue, a plaque, a banner, go and check out the Patreon link down in the description. It keeps the lights on, the food on the table, the paint in the airbrush. Everything here happens because of Patreon.
Then it's painting time. First, some flat grey primer on all our landforming. We'll be dumping scenics all over this later, but it gives us a nice colour foundation. Then a massive board needs a massive vacuum to suck or blow away any loose plaster. And then it's time for our stonework. Up first, we're going to airbrush some base tones, and a massive shout out to one of my awesome Mega Zorptrons, the Sergeant's Table, who sent me some much needed airbrush cleaning supplies, as well as some other mega helpful goodies, so I could finally give my brush a deep clean. After some testing by my official airbrush tester, with an assortment of wargaming scenery critical colors, I started laying in our stone undertoning, picking out a range of bricks with various subtle shades of warm, cool, lighter and darker grey tones. The stonework was then overbrushed with a light grey to blend our new undertones with a neutral kind of highlight consistent with our Zenithal Prime. And then the absolute workhorse layer of the stonework, a super dark blackwash slathered absolutely everywhere. This does our recessed detail and our grime all in one pass and makes the 3D printed components and the foam carved stone look absolutely amazing. It is crazy just how much this combination of undertoning and heavy blackwashing levels up the stonework. Then our final job is of course the big white slabs of plaster. Classic Zorpazorp leopard spotting here, flicking on subtle splotches of browns in various hues and saturations before an all-over wash with a diluted blackwash. I started on the massive rocky outcrops beneath the causeway and then worked from the base of the keep all the way up to the top. With such massive rock formations, gravity is our best friend. Working from the bottom up ensures we still get that consistent coverage, but the layers at the top run down over the lower levels, creating lovely naturalistic toning. Then there was something else we had to do. I can't quite remember, actually. Oh yes, of course, we're doing this again. As we all know, King Theoden loves a good rave. So here we have Helms Deep, not that far from completion, decked out with some valiant defenders charging out to meet the reckless hate of Saruman's hordes. Hopefully this helps you guys get a sense of the stupidly massive scale of this build. Those models are tiny compared to this thing. Jacob and I, however, are going to need a lot more to film our monster battle reports next month. A huge shout out to the folks at Wētā Workshop for making this all possible. I've got the link to the web store down in the description. They have an amazing range of Middle-earth and Warhammer collectibles, which are just absolute works of art and would look incredible in your hobby room.
And a massive thank you to Bamboo Lab for supporting this project with this gorgeous P1S. I have put so many hours on this printer now, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. If you're new to 3D printing, looking for your first FDM printer, or a veteran who needs another machine to pump out even more plastic, the P1S is the printer for you. Links down in the description. Every time I add a new chunk to this board, it's like I just can't imagine it without it. It looks so much more complete. This is Helms Deep, and there is just one video left. What a way to start 2025. I'll see you guys in the next one.